The boarding house door slammed so hard the boys flinched. Sarah didn't. She'd learned not to flinch anymore. Mrs. Pritchard stood in the doorway, arms crossed over her starched apron, face hard as the Wyoming winter descending around them. "I don't rent to women without husbands. Bad for my reputation." Sarah held her youngest son closer. Tommy was 5, shivering despite the blanket wrapped around his thin shoulders. Ben stood beside her, 8 years old and trying to be brave. Jacob, 11, had already climbed back onto the wagon, jaw set, eyes burning with the kind of anger that came from understanding too much too young. "Please," Sarah said quietly. "Just for the night. The storm's coming. Should have thought of that before your husband got himself killed." Mrs. Pritchard stepped back, reaching for the door. "Good evening, Mrs. Brennan." The door shut. The lock clicked. Sarah stood on the porch for a moment. Snow beginning to fall in heavy, wet flakes. She could feel the town watching. Every window on Main Street had a face behind it, lamplight making them glow like judges' eyes. No one moved. No one spoke. Across the street, Mr. Calhoun stood in the window of his bank, arms crossed, mouth curled in something that wasn't quite a smile. She'd seen that look before. It was the look of a man who enjoyed watching people fall. "Ma," Ben whispered. "What do we do?" Sarah turned from the door. Her wagon sat at the hitching post, everything they owned packed into 2 battered trunks. 1 horse, ribs showing, head hanging low. 3 boys. No money left. No family within 200 miles. She looked at the wilderness trail leading out of town, into the dark hills beyond. The temperature was dropping fast. The wind was rising. If they stayed in town, they'd freeze in the wagon. "If they left, we'll camp past the ridge," she said, climbing onto the seat. Tommy whimpered. Jacob said nothing. The wagon creaked forward. Snow gathered on the boys' shoulders like burial shrouds as they reached the edge of town. Sarah glanced back once. Every light in Coldwater burned warm and bright. Every door stayed closed. She turned away. They were a mile into the darkness when she saw him, a rider on the ridge above, silhouette sharp against the dying light. Watching. Waiting. Her hand moved toward the rifle beneath the seat. The rider began to descend. The rider didn't ask her name, didn't ask her story. Just turned his horse and said, "Follow me." Sarah's hand stayed on the rifle. "I don't know you." "No, ma'am." His voice was low, steady. Not friendly, but not cruel either. "But I know that trail you're on leads nowhere. And I know this storm will kill you and them boys by midnight. We'll manage." "You won't." Tommy's teeth chattered so hard Sarah felt it through her coat. Ben had stopped talking an hour ago. Even Jacob, stubborn as his father, had pulled his hat down low, surrendering to the cold. The rider waited. Snow gathered on his hat brim. "Why?" Sarah asked. "Because..." He turned his horse. "Follow or don't. Your choice." She followed. The cabin appeared after 20 minutes, small, weathered, but solid. Smoke rose from the chimney. A barn stood behind it. And beyond that, a single grave marker with a wooden cross. The rider dismounted and opened the cabin door. Firelight spilled out, warm and golden. "Inside," he said. "All of you." The boys stumbled toward the heat like moths. Sarah hesitated at the threshold. The man pulled a canvas sheet from a peg on the wall, began stringing it across the middle of the room with practiced efficiency. "Boys by the fire. You take the bed. I'll sleep in the barn. I won't take charity." He glanced at her, eyes shadowed beneath his hat. "Then call it a trade. You cook. I'll pretend it's charity so my pride don't suffer." Tommy collapsed in front of the fireplace, Ben beside him. Jacob stood rigid, watching the stranger with suspicion. Sarah looked around the cabin clean. Sparse. Everything in its place. A man living alone. A man who'd been alone for a while. "There's stew in the pot," the man said. "Beans in the barrel. Feed them. I'll tend your horse." He walked out before she could respond. Through the frosted window, Sarah watched him lead her exhausted mare toward the barn. He moved slowly, speaking to the animal in tones too low to hear. Then he stopped at the grave marker, hat in hand, snow gathering on his shoulders. He looked like a man who'd forgotten how to come inside. Tommy was already asleep, curled against Ben. Jacob sat by the fire, arms wrapped around his knees. "Who is he?" "Ma," Ben asked. Sarah hung her wet coat by the door. "I don't know, baby." But she looked at the grave again, 2 names carved in the wood. Eleanor and Daniel Tucker. 1879. 3 years dead, and the man still slept in the barn. She ladled stew into bowls with shaking hands. The widow didn't sit still. Cole had noticed that first thing. Always moving, mending, scrubbing, teaching the boys their letters by the fire. 3 days since the storm. The snow had stopped, but the cold hadn't. Sarah insisted on earning her keep. She'd patched his shirts, cooked meals that actually tasted like something, organized the chaos he'd been living in since Eleanor died. The boys worked too. Jacob, serious and watchful, hauled water from the creek. Ben, cheerful despite everything, chopped kindling with fierce determination. Tommy shadowed Cole everywhere, silent as a ghost, watching with enormous eyes. Cole wasn't used to being watched anymore. He sat on the porch step, carving a wooden horse for the boy. His hands shook not from cold, but from memory. Daniel had been 5 when the fever took him. Same age as Tommy, same hungry eyes. Eleanor had begged him to fetch the doctor, but the storm had been too fierce, the town too far. By the time he'd made it back, the knife slipped. Blood welled on his thumb. "Mr. Tucker." He looked up. Sarah stood in the doorway, flour on her hands. "You're bleeding." "It's nothing." She came outside anyway, tore a strip from her apron, wrapped his thumb with efficient gentleness. Her hands were rough, scarred from work, a widow's hands. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "All of it." She sat beside him on the step. "You didn't have to help us." "Yes, I did." Before she could respond, hoofbeats sounded on the trail. Cole stood, instinct moving his hand toward the rifle propped by the door. A rider appeared, Deputy Walsh, red-faced and uncomfortable. "Tucker." "Deputy." Walsh dismounted, handed him a folded paper. "From the church council. Reverend Mills and Mr. Calhoun want you to know. Folks are concerned.